Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar on preparing for audit. This webinar will introduce you to information and resources that you can use to help with audit preparations, to participate in the audit effectively, as well as how to approach your audit results. I'd like to just take this moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our facilitator for today, Michaela Tarpley.
Good morning, everybody. A cast of thousands by the looks of it on the list of attendees. So very welcome to this webinar about preparing for audit. I recognise a few of the names, and I'm sure some of those of you that are listening will have come across me over the last nearly 10 years that I've actually been auditing for TAC. I had a quick look at my records the other day and I was quite shocked to realise it's nearly 10 years. So I've been around the vocational education training world for a considerable time before that. And then, as I say, nearly 10 years with TAC, actually specifically auditing the RTOs that are registered with that organisation. I also do some work with ASCA, but the thing to remember today's work information is specifically about those organisations that are registered with TAC. And quite often, if you those that are registered with ASCA will need to go and find the information directly from that source. Anyway, welcome to everybody. And just to check before we go any further, when you signed up for this webinar, you should have been sent a number of documents. And I just want to double check that you've all got the right documents. So if I do refer to them in the actual webinar, you have got those handy. So there are a couple of flowcharts. They're the flowcharts for desktop audits and site audits, and they just give some detail about the conduct of those audits and timeframes. There is an example of an audit report, which we'll talk about at the very end of the session. And then there are a couple of fact sheets that TAC have provided. Now, these fact sheets are specific to this particular webinar, but as most of you probably know, TAC have a significant number of these fact sheets, which are just truly amazing in their content. And I think even it's worth going through them. They are updated regularly, so just keep an eye on what's the content of those fact sheets, as well as all the other documentation that TAC provides. And there is also a self-assessment tool that you would have been provided with. So what we're going to talk about today, basically, we're focusing on the audit process itself and how to prepare for the number of different types of audit that TAC might conduct with you as an organisation that's regulated with them. So we're going to look at understanding the process and how to prepare for those audits. And those are the two different audits that we're going to focus on, the desk audit and the site audit. And finally, one thing I want to mention now, and we'll be mentioning all the way through the presentation, is what I hope you will take away from this is that you mustn't fear an audit. An audit should be a positive process that everybody comes away feeling that it has been a positive experience from which people have all learnt. As time allows, we'll look at things like the audit report and what happens after an audit, but that will very much depend on how much extra time we've got. Finally, before I go into start the process of the webinar, I just want to remind people I'm happy for you to ask questions during the course of the webinar, and Mel will be keeping an eye on any of those questions that pop up, and there will be a chance at the end for you to ask a few more questions if you have anything that you want clarified. But as I say, really the most important thing is from the very start, I hope this webinar and the information I'm going to give you will help you to understand that an audit is a positive process and you really should not fear any of the audits. as I say, TAC have a wealth of information for RTOs that are regulated by them. And this whole process that I'm going to be talking about is really well summarized on the TAC website. So if you go into their homepage, there is that section on audits. And then if the audits section of the website does break down into the different parts and gives you a lot more detail than I'm able to give you in this short presentation, which is just over an hour. But it's really worth, if you have got audits coming up, it's worth really looking at that information and taking note of what is said. So I suppose the best place to start with anything is to define what we're actually talking about. So what is an audit? The definition of an audit is that it's a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. Well, that's a lovely example of, event speakers, I call it. But the important things in there are audit criteria. So the audit criteria that are going to be considered whenever you're going to be audited by TAC are the policies, procedures, and requirements that sit around the registration of an RTO, specifically the standards for RTOs and training package requirements. An audit is based only on the evidence that is provided. The audit evidence can be examined by or can be gathered by examining and examining documentation, observing RTOs implementing their training and assessment system, or other relevant verifiable records or information that you might be able to provide. But it's essential that you understand that the audit evidence is what the audit process and the audit outcome is going to be based on. There is nothing else except the evidence that you provide that the auditor can actually make a decision on. So, why do TAC conduct audits? Well, they, as the registration organisation, have to make sure that the RTOs that are registered under them actually meet the requirements of the standards and the requirements for training products, and that the training and assessment that is offered by those organisations meets the needs of the learners. So that applies not only to the applicants who are telling TAC what they intend to do, but it's also applicable to the RTOs that are up and running and maybe wanting to extend their scope or renew their registration, etc. But it's all about making sure that the assessment, the audit criteria are actually fulfilled. So there are a number of different types of audits that TAC conducts. Basically, there are those that are triggered by you as the RTO. So it's things like initial registration, those people that have decided they really want to become an RTO registered under the Training Accreditation Council. There are also audits for existing RTOs who have decided they want to add additional training products to their registration, so the amendment to their scope of registration. Obviously, there are also audits for those who are wishing to renew their registration, their existing RTOs, and not to renew their registration, and that's usually around the 7-year mark. But also, if you are a new RTO and you've been newly registered with TAC, usually they conduct a re-registration audit after about 2 years, mainly to check that what you told them in the initial registration audit is actually what you are actually implementing, or if you have made changes, that those changes are compliant. There are also audits that are initiated by TAC. Sometimes there are things like monitoring audits. If, for example, you've had an audit and there were some significant non-compliances and there is some concern about the way in which you were going to implement any of the rectification processes you specified to the to TAC, they will ask another auditor to come in and do a monitoring audit just to make sure that you are doing what you said you were doing. Obviously, there are also audits sometimes triggered by complaints. If somebody has complained to TAC about an RTO and the performance of that RTO, TAC is obliged to investigate, and sometimes that will trigger a complaint audit, and that triggers a whole audit process in itself. Obviously, as part of the TAC strategic direction, they also want to check certain industries. There are so often industries that are of concern, or where there have been high incidents of poor performance, or there are some very difficult and high risk areas such as early childhood or community care, where TAC have decided that they really want to have a closer look at how these are being implemented. It doesn't imply anything about the way in which the RTO that is being audited runs. It's really that they just happen to be delivering those particular training products which TAC have decided they really want to take a closer look at. Then finally, there are some compliance monitoring audits where there have been some severe non-compliances, and again, the TAC really wants to make sure that those RTOs are continuing to do the right thing and continuing to maintain their compliance with the standards, and that the training products they're delivering are being delivered in accordance with the requirements. So regardless of which audits, which trigger there is for an audit, they those audits have to be conducted in the same way. And there are some specific audit principles that TAC requires the auditors who review RTOs on their behalf to stick to. So the first one is systematic. It's not a random activity, an audit process. TAC decides who's going to be audited, what type of audit is going to be, what the scope of that audit is going to be, and then the auditor has to follow those guidelines, and the audit has to be conducted systematically from woe to go. And when an auditor comes to do an audit on an RTO, the important thing to remember is what they're looking for is the outcomes of what you are doing. No RTO is exactly the same as any other, and the way you get to what you do, i.e. the delivery of quality training and assessment, can be very, very different depending on the size of the RTO, your scope of registration, and a myriad of other things. So that's why we're not looking, when we come into to do an audit, we're not looking at your processes specifically. We don't want to see some specific things. What we want to see is the outcomes of how you manage your organization. And are those outcomes actually meeting the requirements of the standards, delivering the training that is required, an assessment that's required by the training packages, and that your students actually have their needs met by the way in which you deliver your services. So it's what we're looking for is the outcomes, not necessarily specific processes. Any audit that's conducted for TAC is evidence-based. And in many ways, that means that the audits that are being conducted are very similar to assessments. At the end of the day, an audit finding can only be made on the information that has been provided by the RTO. So the information you provide is the evidence that the auditor bases their assessment on. So they will be looking for this evidence to demonstrate you comply with specific standards and clauses. They will be looking at whether or not the evidence that you provide to show that you're meeting the requirements of the training products you're actually delivering. and that evidence needs to be looked at in exactly the same way as if you are conducting an assessment with your students. So that means that any judgments that are made about the compliance of your organisation must meet the rules of evidence. So what does that mean? That means, so is the evidence valid? So does it actually reflect what the requirements that have been identified, and the specifically the requirements as the standards and clauses that are being audited? So is it valid? Does it actually demonstrate those particular standards and clauses and the compliance with those? Is the evidence sufficient? And that's often one thing that can be a bit tricky. How do you know how much evidence to provide? But basically, what you want to think about is, am I really demonstrating that my organisation actually meets all the requirements and the audit criteria, and that the auditor can actually make reasonable judgments about the compliance of your organisation? Obviously, the other thing that is really important is the audit evidence authentic. Is it really what you're doing? You can buy these wonderful documentation from consultants, and but are you actually using that evidence, that material, or is it just sitting on a shelf in the corner of your office? It needs to be what you are actually doing. Any evidence you provide needs to reflect what you as an organisation are actually doing and what your actual practice is. So there's no point in providing all these fancy documentation if that's not what you're actually doing. And finally, is the evidence current? Quite often, people will say to me, "Oh, but I've been audited by TAC quite often, on numerous occasions. Why do I have to keep providing the same evidence again and again?" Well, evidence, practices change, continuous improvements are implemented, things do get updated. So it's really, really important, regardless of how many audits you've had in the recent past, that the evidence that you are providing for the auditor to make a judgment on is actually what you are using at this at the moment in time of the audit. So it's really, really important, in particularly in certain industry areas where there's a lot of change, that you can demonstrate that what you're doing is keeping up with the requirements of an ever-changing industry. And the saddest thing is that often an RTO may be doing some wonderful things, but unless they give me enough evidence as an auditor to determine whether or not they're compliant, I can't make that judgment. And there are instances where I've had to find organisations non-compliant just because I haven't got the documents. Usually I go back and ask, but if they're still not providing the documentation to help me make that decision, I have to go to come to the conclusion that they are not compliant. And that is always a shame, because most RTOs are trying very hard to maintain the quality of their training and assessment that they're trying to deliver. Because no two RTOs are the same, the way in which audits are conducted must be flexible. Sometimes I'll go into an organisation, it's a one-man band, there's only one individual, there's one trainer and assessor responding to a very specific requirement, and the sort of evidence that I'm looking at for that type of RTO will be completely different from, say, going in and looking at a TAFE, for example, or one of the bigger organisations. And so it's really important that as an auditor, we appreciate the fact that not one size fits all, and that we must be flexible in what we are looking at and how we are determining if the RTO is actually delivering what they're trying to deliver. All the work we do with RTOs and all the support that TAC gives RTOs is all about continuous improvement. And that is often one of the major things that comes out of any audits that are conducted, that the RTOs usually say that the audit process has actually helped them to continue to identify certain areas and help them to continuously improve the training and assessment services that they provide. Bear in mind that the standards are actually only the minimum requirement for performance. Quite often we will go into RTOs and see our organizations that well exceed the requirements of the standards, and that is just fantastic. And again, if you have an audit and the outcome is compliant, just think about how you can continuously improve on that, the way in which you're implementing your services based on the audit and how you can continuously improve them. As part of the audit process as well, our auditors are often, or certainly encouraged to find opportunities for improvement that we can suggest for RTOs. So it may not be a compliance, it may be just something that they could do. We suggest you could do better, but I'll talk to that a little bit more when we're talking about the audit report. But generally speaking, if an auditor can identify easy improvements, they will always try to do so, because it's the focus of any audit is about continuous improvement. And finally, any audit conducted on behalf of TAC must be fair, open, and transparent. So really make sure there is an obligation on your part to help with this. You must be engaged with the audit. There's no point in just getting the auditor there and just dumping a whole lot of documents in front of them and not really talking to them, because they want to know what's actually going on. They want to engage with you, and that makes sure that they get the best chance of finding out how your organization really operates, and it's the best way you can showcase your organization. However, sometimes RTOs will feel that the audit process wasn't fair, or the outcomes misrepresented what you felt you offered as an organization. And there are complaints and appeal processes which are clearly identified in the TAC website. Okay, the audit team. So you know why you've got to have an audit. You know what the auditor is going to be looking at. So who is it that's actually going to be coming to do the audit, or who is going to be looking at the evidence you're providing? 99% of the time with TAC, it's generally just a single auditor that will either conduct the site visit or look at your desktop evidence to make a determination about the compliance of your organization. Some site visits, there will be an observer. That can be for various different reasons, either because maybe the audit's being conducted in a private home. That will often be the case if it's a one-man band sort of organization. Or maybe the audit is being observed. We actually have performance assessments as well, and performance reviews. So somebody will come along and watch us and see how we conduct the audit. If it's a complaint audit, generally speaking, the auditor will be accompanied by an observer. But whoever it is, and for whatever reason they're there, they must be passive. They don't actually participate. They're really there as just a second pair of eyes. The other people that may be participating in an audit on your behalf are consultants. And there is a bit of controversy about what the role of a consultant should be. Generally speaking, it's worth remembering that if you are inviting a consultant to be with you as part of an audit, they must not participate in the audit itself. The auditor will only be talking to whoever is representing the RTO, the members of staff, or the actual trainers and assessors, etc. The only time a consultant can participate actively in an audit is if they are really definitely part of your organisation permanently and are delegated with authority to provide feedback on the operation of your organisation. In all other instances, the role of the consultant is just to sit and observe. They are not to be part of the process. Okay. Oh, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please add them to the chat box. Okay, so that's the theory behind the audits that you might be involved in through TAC. So really what we're talking about today, and the main crux of what we're talking about today, is how are you actually going to prepare for any of the audits that TAC may either require of you or you may have triggered. So remember, the key issues around an audit is that it's about providing evidence that you and your organisation are meeting the audit criteria, in this case, the standards for RTOs and the requirements of the training package. And as I say, the most important thing is to remember is that any judgment made by an auditor about the compliance of your organisation has to be based on evidence. We cannot take, you can tell us all sorts of wonderful things, but unless you can follow those claims up with specific evidence that you're actually doing all the things that you're talking about, we can't take that into account. So you can't assume that we know anything about your organisation. So please regard each auditor as somebody completely new to your setup, and they won't have any other understanding of your organisation to fall back on. Determining what evidence should be provided for an audit is really down to you as the RTO. And that's what is so important, that you give yourself the best chance to demonstrate compliance. And the way to do that is to make absolutely sure that you are familiar with the audit criteria, as I say, the standards for RTOs and the training products requirements that you're going to be audited against. You need to know those standards inside out, and you need to be thoroughly familiar with the training products that you are delivering. Different audits have different scopes. As I say, initial registration, re-registration tend to be audits focusing on all the standards. They may focus on samples of training products, but generally speaking, they are a much more comprehensive audit than something like an addition to scope audit, where the focus is very much on standard 1, which is about the delivery of training and assessment, and standard 5, where it's about making sure that when you are telling students about the new product you want to add to deliver, that they get a really comprehensive and accurate picture of the services that you're going to be offering. So really make sure you know exactly what the scope of the audit is going to be, and TAC will generally confirm that in a letter once they start confirming the details of the audit. So there's no reason why you should be surprised about what is going to be covered in an audit. There are a few evidence guides that I've mentioned on the slide. So do have a look at those and double check that you've got whatever they've suggested in those guides as a very minimum. Doesn't mean to say you can't add additional evidence and additional information. As I say, those evidence requirements and the requirements for the standards are the minimum, and it's always nice to see that RTOs are going beyond the basic. One of the best tips I can give you as an organisation starting to prepare for an audit, whether it's desktop or site visit, is to try and make the auditor's life as easy as possible. We're all human beings. We all appreciate it when we are given as much assistance with the audit process as we possibly can, and that means that it's really important for you to try and think about how you can represent your organisation in the best way so that the auditor can come to the right conclusion. The most important thing is to clearly identify each piece of evidence that you are going to be submitting. So make sure the file names for your evidence are meaningful. Make sure the file paths aren't too long so that we can actually open the documents, because that sometimes happens where you've got, where the files are really deep down in a complex file path. And make sure that the evidence that you're providing is well organized and logically presented. It's really useful for the auditor if they know what evidence you think, what evidence you're providing, and also it's really good for the auditor to know what your thought processes are so that they can understand what you really think that evidence is trying to demonstrate. So I quite often recommend providing them with a table with the file or folder, and then explaining how each piece of evidence actually demonstrates how you're going to meet the requirements of the standards and the training package. For my part, I also find it a lot easier if you don't zip your files, because it's much harder to go back in and try and look at those documents if they're zipped. The best tip I can give you is to try and give the auditor a really comprehensive list of the documents that you are providing, and if preferably in Word or Excel, and then in that a list next to that list explaining exactly what each piece of evidence is supposed to show. Not only does that make sure that the auditor really understands what you're trying to tell them, but it also makes our life easier, because we have to list the evidence that we review in the audit report. If we can copy and paste a list of evidence from your Word document, it's so much easier for us. But it doesn't matter if you don't do that, but it just makes life easier and makes absolutely sure that you are confident that the auditor is actually looking at everything that you've submitted as part of the audit. Because some people do miss things, and there are sometimes situations where auditor has to find an organisation non-compliant because they just haven't got enough evidence. So we talked in general about what the requirements for audits are and how you can prepare for an audit. And now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the two main different types of audit that are conducted on TAC's behalf. So the first one is the desktop audit, and these are generally conducted by a single auditor who's sat all on their own at their desk and looking at your evidence. The TAC usually considers a desktop audit to be appropriate where they perhaps know that you have the facilities and equipment already. You've already demonstrated that you have those specific facilities and equipment that are going to be perhaps for a change of scope of registration. And that because your training products that you're delivering aren't really changing, so they know that you've got the facilities and equipment, they will consider a desktop audit, particularly for a change of scope application. And and if that change of scope registration is for a particular training product that is similar to what you have on your registration already, then that's when they will consider a desktop audit. There is a flow chart that's been provided for you to have a look at, and that gives you some timeframes about how what the number of days that you have to provide your evidence, the number of days the auditor has to review your evidence, and then if there are non-compliances, how long you have to submit evidence for a review. And it's worth having a look at that if you are planning or intending to be part of a desktop audit. Obviously, a site audit is something much more comprehensive. These are usually conducted for initial registrations and re-registrations, or if you are, as an organisation, intending to change the training packages that you're hoping to deliver as part of your scope of registration. Again, there's the flow chart that shows you exactly how that process works. And just to help you to familiarize yourself with all the requirements, there is the user's guide and then the 2 fact sheets about records management, ensuring quality. And they're really worth having a look at before you start preparing for a site audit. Again, with a site audit, all the auditors appreciate that every RTO that we go into is slightly different. So, and generally speaking, we won't be familiar with your organisation. So you need to assume that we know nothing about the way in which you conduct training and assessment and how your organisation works. The important thing with a site audit, yes, you can provide evidence beforehand to the auditor, and quite often they will want to see a few things from you beforehand so that they can do a bit of a desktop review and then come better informed to the audit process. But the most important thing when you are preparing for an audit is that you are really, really familiar with the standards and clauses to be audited and the training products that are to be audited. You need to make sure that you know the standards inside out, and the TAC User's Guide also gives additional information, and they often give examples of the evidence that you could be submitting to demonstrate compliance. Make sure you are quite clear about the intent and the requirements of the audit that TAC will have provided to you. They usually send out quite a detailed letter to tell you exactly what the scope of the audit is going to be, and make sure you're familiar with that. Look at the audit process on the TAC website. As I say, there's a huge amount of information on there that is really worth looking at very closely before you start preparing for a site audit. And then, based on all of that, consider what evidence you really want to submit. One really good way to make sure that you are fully prepared for a site audit, a comprehensive site audit, for example, for registration or re-registration, is to conduct a self-assessment. And again, there are tools on the TAC website which will help you with this. And it's a really good way of going through all the requirements to make sure that you provide the evidence to really showcase your organisation and demonstrate how you are delivering training and quality training and assessment which meets the requirements. Obviously, depending on the size of the organisation that you are working in, you have to decide on your own team that are going to be participating in the audit. Obviously, one of the first things is to have a point of contact for you for TAC and the auditor. So it's really important that one person actually coordinates the audit so that the auditor is getting consistent information about what evidence you're going to be submitting and how the audit is going to be run. It's really useful, again, if you've got the staff to do it, to have a note taker when the audit is that sits quietly at the side of the audit, audit process, because sometimes the auditors will provide will provide a bit of guidance on certain things, or even make some generalized recommendations, and it's really good for a note taker to jot those down, and also to jot down any non-compliances as they become apparent, so that it's not going to be overlooked when the final audit assessment is conducted and the outcome discussed with the organisation. Obviously, if you've got a number of members of staff, you need to identify which staff you are going to need to be part of the audit, which training products are going to be reviewed, so which of the trainers and assessors you're going to want to have on hand to discuss how those particular products are being delivered. And it's really good that they are kept in the loop and told exactly what you're intending to demonstrate or how you're intending to demonstrate compliance. Also, make sure that your team that is going to be participating in the audit really understands the audit process. That will make them feel much more comfortable about the audit process, and the more relaxed and the more more they feel they're participating effectively in the audit, the better the evidence will be for that the auditor can actually base their decisions on. If you've got a nervous individual, it's much harder to get the information that you need out of them. So really fully inform your staff so that they are not too worried about the actual audit process itself. So when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts of the audit, if it's just going to be one part of one site and it's just one area that you deliver training and assessment, that's fine. But if you're a bigger organization and you're actually going to be taking the auditor around to look at workplaces or other areas or other establishments where you're going to be delivering training and assessment, do make sure you tell the auditor what you're planning and give them a timetable, and make sure that those that are involved in the visit know roughly when you're likely to be arriving. Sorry, stop it again. So also make sure that there is somewhere for the auditor to actually sit and conduct the audit. It's usually a good idea if you've got a room or an office that they can actually conduct interviews in and also gather the evidence. And if it's like me, I spread myself around. So it's really good if you've got somewhere specific for the auditor to actually conduct the audit, and it also gives them an opportunity to talk to people in private and quietly, out of the way of the actual hustle and bustle of the organisation. Finally, just make sure that if there are any special requirements that you let the auditor know beforehand. So, for example, if there's security issues or parking or what you intend to do about morning teas and things like that, just make absolutely sure that the auditor's fully briefed on that before they get there, so that they're not going to be driving around trying to find a parking space or not be able to get into a secure organisation or secure building. One of the things on a site visit that the auditors will probably also do is to look at specific evidence from particular learners. They will usually try and take a sample of the evidence from a number of the learners who have completed the training and assessment that you're offering, so that they can actually track, first of all, how you've recruited them, inducted them, how you've delivered the training, how the assessment process has occurred, and how you've certificated those students. So be prepared to provide that specific evidence for the particular students the auditor chooses. They will be a random selection, so make sure that the auditors either have access to your hard copy materials or access to your online systems that allow them to review that documentation. As I said before, and I keep saying, the most important thing is don't fear the audit. It should be a positive experience. It should be something that allows you to showcase your organisation in the best light. And a good remember, any good auditor is not trying to catch you out. They are not trying to um, make your life difficult. They're desperately, in most instances, all trying their hardest to make sure to get the evidence from you which demonstrates that your organization is compliant. We really do try our very, very, very best to tease out any information that we need, and if we feel that there is more evidence to be had, we will keep going back to you until we've got everything that we need that will allow us to make a really informed decision about your organization. But you really do have to help us in that. But if an audit has been conducted, generally speaking, at the end of it, you should feel that you've got something out of it. It shouldn't have just been a traumatic experience. You should have been able to learn something from the auditors, and even if it's just a few suggestions on how you can continue to improve whatever compliant processes you already have in place. The audit process should not be adversarial, and it's really up to you as well to make sure that you participate in that audit process in a collaborative way, because again, it's to your benefit, because you can then showcase your organization in the best light. But also remember that the auditors can only work with the evidence that you give them. Probably best to err on the side of too much evidence than not enough, because it is really very frustrating for the auditor to end up deciding that an organization has not provided the evidence to demonstrate compliance, and that the outcome of the audit will be non-compliant just because they just haven't seen enough evidence to really establish exactly what the RTO is doing. So please give yourself the best chance. Again, as I've said before, there is a plethora of documentation that and tools and templates that TAC provides for you. Some of you've had with this when you registered for this webinar, but there are also a lot of other documentation that you can use. The website is fantastic. The fact sheets, whether it's just on audits or all the other subjects that the fact sheets are on, are really, really good sources of evidence. You've got the various guides and tools and flow charts. And then, of course, you've got the basic information about the standards and the user guide, and also the training package information. With the training packages, it's really essential you understand the requirements of the qualifications and the units of competency. But don't forget, the companion volumes also provide some really good information, even though it's not as auditable as such. They are really worth looking at and making sure that you have selected what you or taken the advice that's in those companion volumes. Okay, we've got another couple of minutes, and if I haven't seen any questions yet, but I'll just head on to the last bit, which is about talking about what actually happens once you've been participated in the audit. Basically, the auditor will make a final examination of the evidence you submitted. They will start to collate that evidence and put that together in the audit report, which you will then get within 10 days of the audit, generally speaking. Or the auditor has to submit within 10 days. There are three basic parts to the audit, and depending on the scope of the actual audit, this can be an enormous document. So don't be daunted if it's just a case of working through it systematically and making sure that you are aware of what the findings are. And generally speaking, there should be, if there are non-compliances, there should be sufficient information to really specify where the issues were found. The first part of the audit report is the organisational details, the dates, the standards to be audited, who was interviewed, and the scope of delivery being audited. Section 2 is really the summary of the audit findings. So it identifies the overall level of compliance and how the auditor has justified that level of compliance or non-compliance. It will actually specify the standards that are non-compliant and the clauses that are non-compliant. And then, as I said before, there will be an opportunity for the auditor to identify some of the strengths of your organisation, as well as, if there are any, opportunities for improvement. Now, these opportunities, the OFI's opportunities for improvement, don't have to be followed. They don't have to be implemented. But generally speaking, they're there as a bit of a help to continuously improve your delivery of your training and assessment. Often it may be just some minor weaknesses in some of the documentation that you have, or if information is too cumbersome, or if there are some things that are redundant. Quite often there are references to things that no longer apply, maybe to the delivery of training and assessment. And also sometimes the auditors will say, look, you're making your life a bit overly complicated. This is a suggestion for improvement. But that's entirely up to you whether you take note of those or not. The last part of the audit report, which is the meaty part, which is where the compliance with individual clauses and standards clauses and the standards are identified, and the justification. So first, the evidence that's been submitted, and then the justification for any finding, particularly the findings of non-compliance, and they have to be quite specific. But remember, if examples are provided, that doesn't mean to say they're maybe the only examples of the non-compliance. You need to go back and double check the whole of your documentation to see if it applies across the board. So, if you have participated in an audit and the audit report's arrived, it will have in there the overall level of compliance of your organisation. Obviously, everybody's striving for a compliant outcome, but if not, there is a very good fact sheet from TAC, which is about managing non-compliance against the standards for RTOs. Sometimes there are only minor non-compliances. That means that they don't really impact the learners or the workplace too much. And it does, nor is it a serious breakdown of your quality management system and your quality training delivery. It's almost more of a continuous improvement process, and often it's something very minor that would have been identified by the quality indicators that you seek from your students and employers. Then there are significant non-compliances, and these are usually the ones around training and assessment, which impact on the ability to determine whether or not students have actually received the training that they need, or that the assessments have truly determined whether or not those students are competent. Those significant non-compliances can have an impact on the workplace where the students would be entering, having been issued the qualification or the unit of competency from the RTO. So it might be just the training and assessment is not focused enough, or the information that's been gleaned from your quality processes isn't being implemented. Critical non-compliances are the ones that are of most concern. And generally speaking, what that means is the training and assessment that's being delivered does not meet the requirements of the standards and does not confirm that anybody that is being issued with a certification from your organisation actually is compliant and will be effective in the workplace. And it is really quite a significant issue. So the training and assessment might be very or not meeting requirements. And there is also probably a breakdown in the way in which your training organisation is actually being managed, and that the fact that there was no real systematic approach to any feedback that's provided, or the quality indicator data that you collect as and when students leave your organisation. So it's really about saying, well, we cannot we do not hand on heart believe that those students that have graduated from your organisation actually meet the requirements of the training package. And if it's really, really dangerous, then there could be a critical non-compliance, which could lead to risk of injury or death. And in that situation, the auditor can stop the audit process. And often it's to do with work health and safety risks. And it basically means that the audit process has to stop to make sure that nobody is actually going to be hurt. Rarely happens, thank goodness, but if it does, TAC will, generally speaking, talk to other agencies that may be impacted by the findings that the auditor has notified. So what happens next in the last couple of minutes? Basically, if you get an audit report where there are non-compliances, you have, generally speaking, 10 working days to provide additional evidence. If all that evidence then demonstrates your compliance, then the recommendation will go to the council to either issue your registration or extend your scope of registration, or whatever the audit is for. If there are remaining non-compliances, there are various things that decisions that TAC will make, and that could result in either monitoring audits, or they could actually not, if it's an initial registration, not of the organisation registration, or if it's a scope addition to scope, they may deny the addition to scope. If you feel that any of those audit findings don't represent what you feel you provided as an organisation, obviously there is a mechanism for disputing the audit findings, appeals and complaints. But if you're compliant, then that's where TAC will let you know and either reissue your registration, or issue registration for a new organisation, or change your scope of registration if it's an application for amendment to scope. And all those things will then appear on training.gov. So you will be then officially either registered or have a extra training products on your scope of registration. And that's what we always strive for, if at all possible. Sorry, there isn't much time for any questions. If there is anything, Mel, do you want to finish up now?
Yes, so if you do have any questions, feel free to contact TAC. You can do that via the email, or give us a call, and we're happy to take any questions. Otherwise, please have a look on our website, because we do have a lot of information on there. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.